What would you do if your own husband served you DNA test papers in the middle of dinner? One joke about our child's face was all it took for him to turn cold, start investigating me, and plan his revenge. My name is Isolde Harrow. I'm 33, and I used to believe I could get away with anything as long as I smiled at the right moment and made it sound like a joke. Caleb, my husband, 35, always played the straight man to my little quips. He is quiet, patient, the kind of man who takes everything seriously, which I always thought made me look funnier by contrast. We've been married for 7 years. We have a 5-year-old daughter named Amelia, and until recently, people said we were solid. They didn't know the truth, and honestly, I didn't want them to. Caleb's best friend Darren has been around almost as long as I've known Caleb. He's 36, tall, sharp, always the life of any gathering. I work as an office assistant and met Darren through Caleb's circle, but the spark between us was immediate. At first, I told myself it was just playful, that Darren simply noticed me more than Caleb did. Over time, it turned into something else, something I didn't admit out loud. Caleb never caught me in anything, but there were whispers. People in our family noticed Darren hovering, noticed Amelia's little smile that, if you looked too long, seemed to echo his. One evening, in our own kitchen with relatives sitting around the table, I said something careless, something I thought was witty. I pointed out how Amelia looked more like Darren's mini-me than Caleb's. Everyone laughed nervously, but Caleb froze. His mother Ruth shot me a look like knives, while my sister Nina tried to cover with her own laugh. I waved it off, teased that Caleb was too sensitive, that he was jealous of his own child. But from that moment, something shifted in him. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He just stared at me like he had finally seen through all my lines, then pushed his chair back and walked out. I told everyone he was overreacting, but inside I felt the air turn heavy, like the ground under me had cracked open. I didn't know then how far he would go to prove I wasn't the one holding the cards anymore. The first night it really hit me was ordinary in every sense, at least until I opened my mouth. We were in the kitchen, a Saturday evening dinner with Caleb's family, and my sister Nina joining in. Ruth, his mother, had cooked her famous roast and brought it over, insisting Caleb didn't know how to keep us fed if she wasn't around. Martin, his brother, had stopped by too. The table was full. Amelia was chattering happily, and I was in one of those moods where I wanted attention. Caleb was at the head of the table, quiet as usual, sipping his beer and letting everyone else talk. That's when the moment presented itself. Amelia leaned toward Darren, who had dropped in earlier to return some tools to Caleb and ended up staying for dinner. She laughed at something he did, and I thought it was hilarious how much they looked alike when they grinned. Without thinking, I said that Amelia must have gotten Darren's smile, because sometimes she looked like his mini-me. The room went silent, like someone had sucked the air out. Then Nina burst out laughing, probably to save me from the silence, but her laugh was too high-pitched, too forced. Martin looked directly at me, then at Caleb, like he had just caught me saying something obscene. Ruth's face hardened immediately, her fork clinking against her plate. Caleb didn't laugh. He didn't even force a smile. He looked at me, long and flat, and then at Darren, who shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Darren tried to chuckle it off, saying kids pick up faces from all over, but his voice cracked a little. I rolled my eyes and said Caleb needed to lighten up, that I was only joking. I said it with a smirk, as if his silence was the problem, not my words. Amelia was still babbling, unaware of the tension, and I reached to brush her hair back from her face like nothing had happened. Caleb set his beer down without finishing it, pushed his chair back, and stood up. The scrape of wood on tile was louder than anything else in the room. He didn't say a word, just walked toward the door, grabbed his jacket, and left. The slam of the front door rattled the windows. Nina looked at me wide-eyed and whispered that maybe I'd gone too far. I told her not to be dramatic, that Caleb had always been sensitive, and that if he couldn't take a joke, maybe that was his issue. Martin shook his head in disgust, muttering something about boundaries. Ruth didn't even speak to me. She just stared, her face pale with fury, before she stood up, collected her purse, and left as well. Darren stayed frozen in his seat, cheeks burning, clearly wishing he could disappear. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed, acting like I was unfazed, but my heart was pounding. The silence after Caleb left wasn't the kind of silence you recover from easily. I tried to steer the conversation back to something normal, asking Nina about her job, but her answers were short, distracted. Amelia asked where Daddy had gone, and I forced a laugh, saying he needed some air. Inside, I was scrambling for control. If I admitted I was wrong, everyone would know I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. So I told myself the only way forward was to insist it was a harmless remark. After dinner, Darren excused himself quickly, mumbling that he had an early start the next day. Nina stayed behind, helping me clear plates, but she kept giving me looks like she didn't know how to defend me anymore. She finally said Caleb might not let this go easily, that maybe I should apologize before things spiraled. I scoffed, saying men always acted wounded over nothing, and Caleb would come back once he'd cooled off. But deep down, I wasn't sure. I'd never seen him walk out like that before, not in all our years together. When the house was quiet, Amelia tucked into bed, I sat alone in the living room, scrolling through my phone. I wanted to see if Caleb had posted anything, checked his location, anything that would give me a clue. Nothing. Just silence. I texted him asking where he was. No reply. I told myself he was punishing me with silence, that he wanted me to feel guilty, and maybe he did, because the longer I sat there, the more that crack in my chest widened. By midnight, I was pacing the room. I wanted to call Nina again, but I knew she'd just tell me to admit I was wrong. I wasn't ready for that. Instead, I rehearsed excuses in my head, little speeches about how everyone knew I was joking, about how Caleb always overreacted. I even planned to blame Darren, to say he'd made me nervous with how close he was to Amelia, and that was why the word slipped out. Anything to shift the focus off me. When Caleb finally came home hours later, I was half asleep on the couch. He walked past me without a word, went straight upstairs, and closed the bedroom door. I followed, ready to deliver my lines, but when I opened the door, he was already in bed, back turned, lights off. He didn't speak, didn't move. I stood there in the dark staring at him, and felt this unease creeping up my spine. I told myself he'd get over it, that he always did. But the truth was sitting heavy in the room. That joke had opened something between us I didn't know how to close. And when I finally slid under the sheets beside him, he shifted slightly, pulling away. It was a small move, but it felt louder than the slam of that door earlier. That night, I realized Caleb wasn't just upset. He was changing, and I had no idea what he was planning next. At work the following week, I told myself everything would go back to normal. Caleb hadn't spoken much since that night, but silence wasn't unusual for him. I convinced myself it was just his way of cooling off, that eventually he'd come around like he always did. So I acted normal, carried on like nothing had changed. In the office, though, the whispers were different. Darren stopped by a few times with paperwork, and I noticed the way people looked at us. A couple of my co-workers exchanged glances whenever he lingered near my desk. One even asked if Caleb was okay with how much time Darren and I spent together. I laughed it off, saying people like to imagine drama where there wasn't any. Still, their questions lingered in my head. Darren tried to act casual, but I could see the tension on his face. He didn't stay long anymore, and when he did, he kept his distance. That bothered me more than I wanted to admit. After all, Darren was the only one who made me feel seen, like I wasn't invisible. Caleb never asked about my day, never noticed when I changed my hair or wore a new dress. Darren did, and now even that small comfort seemed to be slipping away. When I went home that night, Caleb was sitting at the kitchen table scrolling through his phone. He didn't look up when I walked in. I set my bag down and tried to sound cheerful, asking if he wanted me to cook something or order takeout. He just said he wasn't hungry. The tone was flat, clipped, not angry, but worse, like I wasn't worth the effort. I tried again, asking about his day, but he gave short answers, never lifting his eyes from the screen. Finally, I snapped and asked if he was going to keep pouting over one joke. That got his attention. He set his phone down and looked at me, but the expression in his eyes was unreadable. He asked why I'd say something like that in front of his family. I rolled mine and told him it was a joke, that everyone knew it. He said it didn't sound like a joke. I accused him of being paranoid, of letting his insecurities make him see things that weren't there. The conversation ended with him shaking his head and walking away. That night, I vented to Nina on the phone. She told me Caleb was probably still hurt and that maybe I should just say sorry. I told her I wasn't going to apologize for a joke, especially when it was clear Darren was just a convenient scapegoat for Caleb's jealousy. Nina hesitated but eventually said she could see my point. She reminded me that men often made mountains out of molehills, and maybe Caleb just needed time. That comforted me, but only a little. Over the next few days, I noticed Caleb's behavior shifting. He started spending more time alone, in the garage or out with Martin. When he was home, he barely interacted with me, though he was warm and attentive with Amelia. That contrast stung more than I cared to admit. I accused him one night of ignoring me while putting on a show of being super dad for Amelia. He didn't rise to the bait. He just tucked her in and closed her bedroom door before heading downstairs, leaving me stewing in silence. One evening, I walked into the living room and found him scrolling through old baby photos of Amelia. He zoomed in on her eyes, her smile, studying them with a kind of quiet intensity that made my stomach twist. When he noticed me watching, he locked his phone and set it down. I asked what he was doing. He said nothing, just looking at pictures. I laughed and said he was acting weird, that he was obsessing over shadows. He didn't argue, just got up and went to bed. That unsettled me even more. The man who used to debate me, who would push back when I teased him too hard, now just absorbed it all in silence. At work, Darren barely spoke to me anymore, and the gossip only grew louder. A colleague made a sly comment about how Amelia had his eyes, and I snapped back too quickly, denying it. The way her eyebrows raised told me I'd revealed more than I intended. I told myself Caleb couldn't possibly know anything, that he was too reserved, too trusting. But his silence felt sharper now, like a blade being sharpened in the dark. When I told Nina about him looking at baby pictures, she said it sounded like he was overthinking. I agreed out loud, but inside I wasn't so sure. That night, as I lay in bed beside him, I noticed he was still awake, staring at the ceiling. I asked what he was thinking about. He said nothing. I pressed, and he finally said he was just going over some numbers for work. I knew he was lying. I didn't call him out, though. Instead, I rolled over, telling myself he'd get tired of this phase soon enough. But the unease stayed with me. Something in his stillness was more dangerous than any fight we'd ever had. I didn't realize it yet, but Caleb wasn't just cooling off. He was planning. And every quiet glance, every word he didn't say, was another step toward a decision that would blindside me. The restaurant gathering was supposed to smooth things over. At least that was my idea. Caleb's parents, his brother, my sister Nina, and even Darren ended up there because I wanted to show everyone that things were fine. I thought if I played the perfect hostess, smiling and making light jokes, Caleb would drop the cold act. From the start, though, the energy was off. Caleb barely spoke, answering questions with one-word replies. He focused on Amelia, cutting her food, asking if she wanted more juice, but he hardly looked at me. That silence was unbearable, so I tried to fill it. I kept up a cheerful chatter, talking about work, Amelia's school, even the weather, anything to keep the table lively. It didn't work. People noticed the chill between us. At one point, Amelia laughed at something Darren said, her whole face lighting up. And before I could stop myself, I leaned back and announced that she must have inherited Darren's smile. I meant it to be playful, like a callback to the joke I'd made before, a way of reclaiming the narrative and proving I wasn't ashamed. The reaction was instant. Forks paused midair, conversations died, and the weight of the stairs pressed down on me. Caleb didn't move. He didn't even flinch. He just sat still, jaw tight, eyes on his plate. Ruth's face turned crimson with fury. She put her napkin down sharply and muttered that she'd had enough of my disrespect. Martin looked between Caleb and Darren like he wanted to start a fight right there. Darren shifted uncomfortably, tried to laugh it off, saying Amelia was a mix of everyone and that kids always borrowed features from friends of the family. But his voice sounded strained, unconvincing. Nina rushed in with her usual defense, laughing too loudly and saying I was only joking, that everyone needed to relax. I clung to that line, nodding and insisting Caleb was just insecure, making drama out of nothing. I even told the table that Caleb had been sulking for days, and maybe he should just admit he was jealous of his own daughter's smile. People gasped, and for a moment I thought maybe they'd see my point, but the look on Ruth's face told me I'd only made things worse. She stood abruptly and told Caleb she wasn't going to sit there and watch me humiliate him again. Then she walked out, muttering about shame and betrayal. Martin leaned in close to Caleb and said, loud enough for me to hear, that he needed to stop letting me walk all over him. My own parents weren't there, which was probably for the best, but I could imagine the embarrassment they would have felt. Nina gave me a look that begged me to stop, but I wasn't about to back down in public. I told her later I had to control the story, or else everyone would believe Caleb's silence meant I was guilty of something. Darren excused himself soon after Ruth left, mumbling about an early morning. The table felt emptier without him, though the damage was already done. Amelia, confused, asked where everyone was going. I forced a smile and said people were just tired. Caleb finally moved then, pushing his chair back slowly. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and placed a folded napkin on the table. He told no one goodbye, just walked out of the restaurant with that same unreadable expression he'd worn for days. For a moment, no one moved. Then Martin muttered something about not being surprised and followed after him. Nina squeezed my hand under the table, whispering that I had to stop making it worse, but I yanked my hand away. I wasn't going to be lectured by her, not when she didn't understand the pressure of being judged constantly. I told her Caleb was being dramatic, that he'd come back once he cooled off, but when I glanced at the napkin he'd left, I saw black ink scrawled across it. 4 words, "This ends soon." My stomach dropped, but I hid it, folding the napkin into my purse as if it were nothing. Out loud, I joked that Caleb had a flair for the dramatic, always trying to make himself the victim. Nina didn't laugh, neither did anyone else. The rest of the meal was tense, people picking at their food, avoiding eye contact. When it ended, I plastered on a smile, hugged Amelia close, and told everyone Caleb and I would work it out. Inside, though, I felt that creeping unease again. The way he left, calm and wordless, was more threatening than any shouting match could have been. It wasn't anger I had seen in his eyes, it was resolve. And for the first time, I wondered if maybe he wasn't just sulking. Maybe he was building something I couldn't see yet, something meant to break me, in a way no joke could undo. Back at home, the silence grew into something heavy, something that seemed to spread through every corner of the house. Caleb no longer argued with me, which at first I thought was a blessing. Arguments I could handle. Silence was harder. He stayed out late some nights, telling me he was working extra hours or with Martin. I tried to press for details, but his answers were vague, almost rehearsed. When he was home, his attention was all for Amelia. He played with her on the living room floor, helped her with schoolwork, tucked her into bed with stories. To anyone watching, he looked like the perfect father. But when it came to me, it was as if I wasn't there. He barely looked at me, never asked how my day was, never touched me. I felt invisible, and I hated it. One night, I cornered him in the kitchen while he was rinsing dishes. I asked if he planned to ignore me forever. He said calmly that he was focused on Amelia. I told him he was abandoning me, that he was punishing me over nothing. He just dried his hands and left the room without a word. That made my blood boil. I called Nina, venting that Caleb was being cruel, acting like a ghost in his own house. She told me again to apologize, that maybe he'd soften if I admitted I was wrong. I snapped at her, asking why I should grovel when he was the one overreacting. She went quiet, and for once she didn't argue. That silence scared me more than anything. A few days later, Caleb's mother came over uninvited. Ruth walked straight into the living room and told me in front of Amelia that I had humiliated her son beyond repair. She said she knew what I had done, that everyone could see the truth if they only looked at Amelia. My face burned, but I forced a smile and told her she was imagining things. Caleb didn't defend me. He just sat there, holding Amelia close, while Ruth's words filled the room. Later, when I accused him of letting his mother disrespect me, he said only that she had every right to her opinion. I couldn't stand it. I phoned my parents, hoping for support, but all they did was tell me to calm things down, to try to see it from Caleb's side. Their embarrassment was clear in their voices. They didn't want neighbors or family friends gossiping about us. I felt cornered on all sides. That evening, I went upstairs after putting Amelia to bed and found Caleb sitting at the edge of our bed. His wedding band was on the nightstand. When I asked why he'd taken it off, he said nothing. He just got up, brushed past me, and went to sleep in the guest room. I stared at that ring for a long time, fury bubbling in my chest. I told myself he was trying to manipulate me, to guilt me into admitting something I hadn't done, or at least wouldn't admit. The next morning, he was already gone when I woke up. He left no note, no explanation, just silence. That weekend, I tried to regain control. I dressed Amelia up, posted pictures online of us smiling together, captioned with sweet words about family. I wanted everyone to see that I was fine, that Caleb was just sulking. But even as I hit post, I felt the hollow weight inside me, because Caleb wasn't just sulking anymore. He was moving, deliberately, quietly, towards something final. That night, when I checked the kitchen counter, the ring was gone. The empty spot where it had sat felt louder than any slammed door. And I realized, with a chill I couldn't shake, that Caleb wasn't just drifting away from me. He was preparing to cut me off completely. The knock on the door came on a Thursday evening, just after I had settled Amelia with her coloring books. At first I thought it was a delivery, but when I opened it, a man in a suit handed me a sealed envelope and asked me to confirm my name. My stomach dropped before I even read the first line. Inside were legal documents, requests for a DNA test and notice of custody proceedings. I froze, rereading the words as if they would change. Caleb hadn't shouted, hadn't accused me directly, hadn't demanded answers. He had gone straight to lawyers. My hands shook as I carried the papers into the living room. When Caleb came in from the garage a few minutes later, I waved the envelope at him, demanding to know what this was. He stayed calm, said it was the only way to get clarity. I accused him of traumatizing Amelia, of turning our home into a courtroom. He said Amelia deserved to know the truth. His tone was steady, almost gentle, but his eyes were cold. I tried everything. I said he was humiliating me in front of everyone, that people would gossip once they heard about this. I told him I would never forgive him for dragging our daughter into adult issues. He just repeated that Amelia's future mattered more than my pride. I called Nina in tears, explaining that Caleb had crossed a line. She was furious on my behalf, saying he was being cruel, but even she sounded hesitant, like she was losing faith in me. When I told Ruth about the documents, hoping she'd see how extreme Caleb had become, she surprised me. She said good, it was about time. Martin agreed, telling me I had brought this on myself with my jokes. I felt the walls closing in. My parents tried to play peacemakers, saying lawyers were too drastic, that we should talk it out, but Caleb wasn't budging. The next day, I had to sit across from him and his lawyer in a sterile office. The lawyer outlined the petition, a DNA test for Amelia, a review of financial accounts, and preliminary custody plans depending on the results. I couldn't believe how far he had gone already. I tried to speak directly to Caleb, asking if he really wanted to put his daughter through this. He looked at me but didn't answer. The lawyer spoke for him, calm and professional, while I grew more frantic. I accused them of ganging up on me, of trying to erase the family we had built. The lawyer simply slid more papers across the table, pages full of dates, bank statements, timelines, evidence Caleb had already gathered. He had been planning this for weeks, maybe months, while I told myself he was just sulking. When I left the office, I called Nina again, demanding she tell me what to do. She told me to hold my ground, that Caleb was bluffing, but deep down, I knew he wasn't bluffing. He had crossed a line of no return, and there was nothing dramatic or angry about it. He was precise, deliberate, and utterly done with me. That night, I found another envelope on the counter. It wasn't addressed to me. It was Caleb's affidavit. I skimmed the lines and felt the blood drain from my face. He had written, in black and white, that Amelia might not be his biological child. Seeing those words, so stark and final, broke something in me. I crumpled the paper in my hands, trying to breathe. I wanted to scream at him, but when I looked up, he was sitting across the room, calm and silent, watching me like he had already let go. For the first time, I realized I wasn't in control anymore. Caleb wasn't my quiet, patient husband waiting to cool off. He was my opponent, and he had the law on his side. The courthouse smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant, the kind of place where everything feels permanent, whether you want it to or not. I sat stiff in the chair, fingers clenched around a folder of my own documents that suddenly felt like props in a play I wasn't winning. Across the table sat Caleb, his lawyer beside him, calm and organized. He wasn't glaring at me, wasn't even angry. That made it worse. He looked steady, resolved, like a man who had already made peace with losing something important. I told myself I still had power, that if I spoke convincingly enough, people would see I was right. The mediator opened with polite words about cooperation and family unity, but no one really believed them. The test results were already in a sealed envelope at the center of the table, and every eye kept drifting toward it. I hated that little packet more than anything I'd ever seen. When they opened it and began to read, the room went silent. DNA confirmed Darren Shaw as Amelia's biological father. My stomach lurched, even though I'd always known deep down what the outcome would be. Still, hearing it spoken aloud was like being branded. My first instinct was to deny, to tell them mistakes happen, that labs mix up samples. I leaned forward and said it must be wrong, that Caleb was her father in every way that mattered, but no one looked convinced. Caleb didn't even raise his voice. He just said this was the truth he had expected. I tried to pivot, telling everyone that biology doesn't decide love, that Amelia knew Caleb as her father, and nothing should change that. I accused him of ripping apart her sense of security just to punish me. The mediator reminded us both to focus on solutions, not accusations, but my words were already tumbling out in a spiral. I said Caleb had no right to rewrite history, that Amelia would be destroyed if he distanced himself. He finally spoke more firmly then, saying he wasn't abandoning her. He was fighting for her future, for clarity, for stability. He said what hurt most wasn't the betrayal itself, but how easily I had laughed about it, how publicly I had humiliated him. That stung because it was true, though I'd never admit it to his face. My defense was to shift blame. I said he had neglected me for years, that Darren had been there when Caleb wasn't, that any mistakes I made were because I felt invisible. My words sounded thin even to my own ears. His lawyer slid more evidence across the table. Records of my messages with Darren, phone logs, photos. I hadn't realized how much Caleb had collected, quietly, while I thought he was sulking. I glanced at the pages and felt heat rise in my face. Nina had told me to stay strong, to hold my line, but sitting there, I felt cornered. I tried to remind everyone of the good moments, of Caleb holding Amelia as a baby, of birthdays and holidays where we looked like the perfect family. I said you can't erase years of love with a test result. But Ruth, sitting behind Caleb, gave a sharp laugh and said love doesn't come with lies. Her voice cut through me like glass. Even my parents, seated quietly on my side, looked down at their hands, unable to meet my eyes. The mediator asked about custody, and Caleb's lawyer laid out his plan. Joint custody on paper, but primary residence with Caleb until Amelia was older. He would allow me visitation, but only within structured limits. He had already arranged financial protections to separate his accounts from mine. Everything was tidy, clinical, devastating. I tried one last time to play on emotions. I leaned toward Caleb and asked if he really wanted Amelia to grow up thinking her mother was the villain. I said he could choose to forgive me, to keep the family whole for her sake. His eyes softened just for a second, and I thought maybe I'd crack through. But then he shook his head. He said forgiveness and trust were not the same thing, and what I had broken could not be pieced together by pretending. I wanted to scream at him, to remind him of every time he had failed me, every moment of boredom and neglect that pushed me into Darren's arms. But the words stuck because none of it would change the truth sitting in that folder. The mediator closed the session by confirming the custody agreement and noting the DNA test results for the record. The sound of the gavel wasn't loud, but it felt like thunder in my chest. Papers were signed, hands shaken, formalities completed. Just like that, the life I'd been clinging to was officially dismantled. When we stepped out of the room, I reached for Caleb, desperate to say something that might hold him back. I told him biology didn't matter, that Amelia still needed both of us together. He looked at me with tired eyes and said he would always be Amelia's father in the ways that counted, but he would no longer be my husband. Then he walked past me, steady and calm, Ruth at his side, Martin trailing behind. Even Nina wouldn't meet my gaze. She turned away, lips pressed tight, as if even she had run out of excuses for me. Amelia wasn't there, thank God, but I imagined her little voice asking where Daddy had gone, and for once I had no clever story to cover it. I stood alone in the corridor, papers clutched in my hands, watching Caleb's figure recede down the hall. Each step he took felt like another wall closing in around me. I'd always thought I could spin words, laugh off mistakes, twist stories to make myself the victim. But here, in the harsh light of the courthouse, there was nothing left to spin. The truth was written, stamped, and signed. Caleb had taken everything that mattered, his dignity, his daughter's security, his future, and pulled it back from me with the force of quiet determination. The last image I had of him was walking through the courthouse doors, sunlight catching on the papers he held. Custody papers, proof that Amelia would stay with him, proof that I had lost. And as the doors closed behind him, I realized the silence he'd carried all those weeks had been the sound of him preparing my undoing. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.